Hi dears, today we are going to start a new chapter. The inheritance and variation. The principles of inheritance and variation. Okay, so here this chapter, it is under one of the most important branch of biology. Okay, that is what? Genetics. Okay, so what is meant by the term genetics? The term genetics, it was coined by Bateson, a scientist, Bateson, in 1905. Genetics deals with the inheritance, the heredity and variation of characters from parents to their offspring. Okay. So what is genetics? It deals with inheritance and variation of characters from parents to offspring. Okay. And this term, it was coined by Bateson in 1905. Some of these basic principles you have studied in the 10th standard. Okay. So what is meant by the inheritance and variation? So genetics deals with inheritance and variation. Then what is meant by inheritance? It's a process by which the characters are passed on from parents to their offspring. So there are different characters. We have different characters. We got all these characters from our parents. And we will transfer these characters to our children. Okay, so there is a transfer of characters throughout the generation. So inheritance is the process by which these characters are passed on from the parents to their offsprings. Okay. Then what is variation? It's the degree by which the offsprings which are different from their parents. We know that we are all similar to our parents. Okay, we are all similar to our parents, but we are not identical to our parents. So we have there is some variation. There is some differences between the parents and the offsprings. So the degree by which the offsprings are different from their parents, it is known as what? The variation. Okay. So we know that there is variation. Okay. We are all similar to our parents, but we are not identical to our parents. So this idea, did our ancestors have this type of idea? Yes, they also had this type of idea. They also knew something about the variation. Okay, they also exploited the variation. Okay, variation is seen in the sexual reproduction. Okay, one of the causes of variation is what? The sexual reproduction. Our ancestors also knew about this variation, and they exploited this naturally occurring variation. Okay, by breeding some domestically the domestical plants and animals, they have selectively breed. Okay, the desirable characters. Okay, so in that way we exploited this naturally occurring variation. And now we have the ancestral wild cows. From the ancestral wild cows, we have created so many Indian breeds through this naturally occurring variation. Okay, so we selectively taken the desirable characters. Okay, so one of the reason for variation is what? The sexual reproduction. Okay. So in the case of asexual reproduction, okay, in the case of the asexual reproduction, the progeny are what? Exact copies. The exact copies of the parents. They are similar as well as identical. Okay, so they are known as what? The clones. But in the case of sexual reproduction, the progeny of sexual reproduction, that is known as what? offsprings. These are similar to their parents, but they are not identical to their parents. Okay. So now we are going to study about one of the most important scientists who did so many experiments. He was the first scientist to do such a kind of experiments regarding the mechanism of the transmission of characters from parents to their offsprings. Okay, so he was what? Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was the scientist who have done this kind of experiments. Okay, so he have done hybridization experiments by using a garden pea plants. Okay, he have done hybridization experiments by using the garden pea plants, and he proposed by from his experiments he have proposed different principles of what? Inheritance, the principles or the laws of inheritance. Okay, and Gregor Mendel was considered as the father of genetics. Okay, so he was the first scientist to find to have done this kind of experiments, the hybridization experiments. Okay, to find out the mechanism of the transmission of characters from their parents to offsprings. Okay, and he's the father of what? Genetics. Okay, and he conducted these hybridization experiments in the garden pea plants. He selected the garden pea plants for his experiments. Okay, and from these experiments he have proposed different principles or different laws of what? Inheritance. So let's know about what are his experiments and what are his postulates, what are his principles of what? Inheritance. So Mendel conducted artificial pollination or cross pollination experiments by using these pea plants, garden pea plants. For this he have selected 14 true breeding pea plant lines. Okay, 14 true breeding plants. So what is meant by true breeding? The true breeding plants lines which are selected by continuous self-pollination. Okay, through the continuous self-pollination. So through this continuous self-pollination, we can select a stable trait. For example, a tall plant will always produce tall plant for continuous generation. Okay. Then a dwarf plant will produce only dwarf plant. A yellow flowered plant will produce only yellow flowered plant. So like that, you have selected true breeding pea plants, 14 true breeding pea plant varieties for his experiment. Okay, so for this experiment he has selected these 14 true breeding pea plant varieties which were similar except in one character. Okay, they were similar, but there is only one character was different. Okay, so he has selected 14 true breeding pea plant varieties and there were 7 characters. For example, the shape of the seed. So like that, what? The stem, the height of the stem or the plant size. These are different characters. So he has selected 7 characters. Each character may have 2 forms. So there are total 14 true breeding plant varieties. Okay. So for example, here we are taking the example, the plant size is the character. For each character, there may be 2 forms. So these 2 forms of a character is known as the trait. Okay. So here in this example, plant size is the character. These are 2 forms, tall and dwarf, or tall and short. These are 2 forms. So these 2 forms are known as what? Trait. Okay. So for the inheritance, for studying the inheritance of one gene or monohybrid cross. You have selected these plants. Okay. So what is meant by a monohybrid cross? It's a cross involving two forms of a single trait. A cross involving two forms of a single trait. So here in this example we are taking the single character, that is what? The plant size. Okay, these are what? The two forms. So a cross involving two forms of a single trait is known as what? A monohybrid cross. Okay, so in this cross we have selected what? A true breeding tall plant. A true breeding tall plant. He crossed a true breeding tall plant with a true breeding dwarf plant. You just crossed it. Okay. Then you got the progeny. Okay, here you got a progeny, and that progeny is known as the first filial generation or F1 generation. So he crossed what? A tall plant with a dwarf plant. Both of these plants were pure breeding, true breeding. Okay. So he have got in the F1 all the tall plants. Then the next step, he self crossed it one. Okay. Then in the second generation you have got 75% tall plants and 25% dwarf plants. Okay, in the ratio 3:1. Okay, so this is a type of what? The monohybrid cross. So this type of monohybrid cross, it can be represented by using a diagram. The diagram is known as what? That is known as Punnett square. It's a diagram used to represent a typical monohybrid cross. So let's see the diagram. Before moving to the diagram, we can learn about some of the symbols which is used in the genetics. Okay, so a capital letter which is used to represent the trait in the F1 stage. Okay, it is used, capital letters are used for the trait which was expressed in the F1, first filial generation. Okay, so here the F1 stage, the trait expressed was what? Tall. Okay, for that we have used what? A capital letter T. So such type of trait that was expressed in the F1 stage is known as the dominant trait. And the trait which was not expressed, okay, that is known as what? The recessive trait. Okay, it is represented by the small letter. Okay. Then the true breeding, the homozygous of the true breeding plants. Okay, these are represented as what? This way. It is represented like this. The true breeding homozygous. Okay. If the two forms or the two genes or the two factors which are different, it is known as what? Heterozygous. So this represents heterozygous condition. Both of these represents homozygous condition. Okay. Then what is phenotype and genotype? The physical appearance. The physical appearance is known as what? The phenotype. Okay. For example, here the tall and dwarf. The genetic constitution. The genetic constitution is known as what? The genotype. The genetic constitution of an organism, that is known as what? Its genotype. So in this example, these are what? The genotypes. Okay. Now let's see the diagram, the Punnett square. So listen here, this is the Punnett square. Okay, so Punnett square, it is a diagram used to represent a typical monohybrid cross. Okay, so here Mendel selected a true breeding tall plant with a true breeding dwarf plant. He crossed a true breeding tall plant. It is represented like this. Okay, so here the dwarf plant, it is represented like this. Okay. So these true breeding plants, it was crossed. Okay. So it has to be represented like this. So here, these are what? The gametes. Okay. So here in this case, as it is true breeding, here the gametes are similar. Here also the gametes are similar. Okay. So in the F1, he got all these what? They are having the tall plants. All of the F1 generation was what? Tall. Okay. So he crossed here. These were the parents. The parents were tall and dwarf. But all the F1 generation was what? The tall plants. Okay. But in the F1 generation there was no dwarf plants. Okay. Then he self-pollinated the F1. The F1 plants were self-pollinated. Okay. So these are the gametes. So here 2 gametes are there. Okay. So in the F2 generation, you have got 75% of the tall plants, but the 25% was what? The dwarf plants. In the ratio 3:1. So this is the phenotypic ratio. Okay. Then the genotypic ratio, that is what? 1:2:1. So this is one genotype. Okay. This is the second genotype. So the 1, 2 and again 1. Okay. So this is the diagram that can represent a monohybrid cross. So this is the parents, then this is F1 generation, then F1 again self-pollination. Okay, then we will get the F2 generation. So in the F2 generation, you have got 75% tall plants and 25% what? Dwarf plants. So based on these observations, Mendel found that something was transmitted, something was inherited from parents to their offsprings. Okay, so something was stably inherited from their parents to their offsprings. Okay, so based on these observations, he proposed that something was inherited from their parents to these offsprings, and he called these something as what? The factors. Now these factors are known as the genes. So Mendel's factors are now known as what? The genes. And the various forms of a gene is known as the alleles or allelomorph. Alleles or allelomorph. So here these are the various forms of the genes. Okay, so here capital T and small t. These are various forms of the gene. So these are what? Alleles each other. Okay, these are alleles of each other. Then these are alleles of each other. Okay, so here in this experiment, this monohybrid cross, Mendel have selected a true breeding plant, true breeding tall plant and a true breeding dwarf plant. So tall plant is represented like this. Both should be capital T. Here both should be small t. Okay, so these are the gametes. Okay, gametes should be represented in a circle. Okay, then in the F1 generation you have got only tall plants. Okay, in the F1, all the F1 plants were tall. There was no dwarf plants. But in the F2 generation, he found that there is also what? Dwarf plants also found. Okay, but in the F1 generation there was no dwarf plants. So this time he just surprised that how these dwarf plants have come in the F2 generation, because in the F1 generation there was no the dwarf plants. Okay, so in the F1 generation there was no dwarf plants, but in the F2 generation there he got the dwarf plants. Okay, so he just imagined that there was something. He just thought that there was something was stably inherited from the parent to these offsprings. So he called that something as what? Factor. Okay, and that factor is known as what? The genes. And the various forms of the genes is known as what? The alleles. Or it is known as what? Allelomorphs. Okay, so by doing this experiment, he have proposed different laws. Okay, so by doing this experiment, he have proposed two important laws or two important principles of what? Inheritance. These are known as the law of dominance and law of segregation. So in the next class we will learn about these different principles. Okay, so now we are going to conclude in this section, and you may go through your textbook, and if you find any difficulty, any doubt, you can call me. Okay, so now bye bye.